So this is introductory talk to computational neuroscience. Like I said, it's not going to be like a serious seminar. It's more an overview of the field, and especially I want to talk about and emphasize an aspect of the field because usually you read about neuroscience in popular media, like some blog article or in your I think Austin Times or whatever the local paper is. You often see some kind of a science column articles on neuroscience, right, about some new multi-million dollar project which is launched, with NIH funding or something, or right, a new drug which holds sort of promise for Alzheimer's cure or Parkinson's cure or so discovery of a new gene for some disease. So you see a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of buzz about neuroscience in popular media, whichever way you turn, about new technology coming up all the time. So if there's so much money poured in and so much stuff going on all the time, how come if you just look around, you don't see like any of the major brain disorders, getting cured, right? I mean, you can look at your grandparents or relatives or friends and family. Somebody has depression, somebody has schizophrenia. I mean, this is still the same, right? So I want to talk about the situation on the ground, and I wouldn't say it's a problem, but there is certain aspect of biology research because I come from engineering background. I kind of I'm an electrical engineer by basic training, and I kind of moved into neuroscience gradually. So when I look at neuroscience from the eyes of an engineer, things look very different to me. And I see one major problem, right? And I keep talking about it everywhere. So this overview of computational neuroscience, which I'm going to give, is somewhat personal and it's like it's a bird's eye view because later on, if you take the trouble to get into neuroscience and learn various branches of neuroscience, like molecular neuroscience, cellular neuroscience, system neuroscience, and try to put it all together, probably you'll resonate with what I'm talking about today. Okay, so let me proceed. So what is happening is the brain is made to look as if it's extremely complicated. It's so complex that you will never be able to understand. There is always, right, something more, and so there is a lot of hype, right? But whereas I would like to argue that just like a tortoise has this hard shell on one side, but if you flip it, there is a soft underbelly. So similarly, even if you take the most complex object that you can think of, if you understand it from the point of view of principles, it can look very simple. It can be made to look very simple, right? Because if you take a very complex artificial object like a Boeing 787 or something, it's extremely complex. It'll have millions of parts. But we're not intimidated by that complexity because we have designed it and we understand underlying principles. It's electrical structure, it's structural engineering, design, the fluid flow patterns and the drag and lift and all this is something where there is a handful of fundamental principles and bunch of fundamental equations which capture those principles. And therefore, we're able to master the complexity. We're not afraid of the complexity, right? Whereas in brain, it doesn't look that way. It's complex, completely. It's just complex and more complex. So what I would like to argue is brain also, if you look at it from point of view of certain principles, it does look simple. And so I keep saying that we should quit calling brain complex and we should keep saying brain is simple. But if you look at it from the point of view of principles. Okay, so now you see that this tendency to make brain sound extremely complicated, or rather more complicated than what it actually is very common in popular media. So, for example, you might have seen this sentence in popular media. People say that the number of neurons in the brain is more than the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. I mean, you might have seen this quoted very often. So that's not quite true. I mean, even factually, right? So number of neurons in the brain, earlier people thought adult brain has 100 billion neurons. Subsequently, it's been revised, kind of downgraded to about 86 billion neurons. And whereas the number of stars in Milky Way galaxy, people thought it's initially 100 billion, but then number went up to 400 billion and so on and so forth. So, but okay, even if it is about the same thing, so what, right? It's like, let's say I grab some sand in my hand. Number of silicon atoms in that handful of sand is more than the number of right? Neurons in the brain, or number of neurons in the brain is. So what is the point in that kind of comparison? You can always make up large numbers and scare yourself, but that doesn't give you any insight. Let me give you one more example. This is a very commonly touted quotation. So people say that the brain is the most complex object in the universe. When you say object, you mean like a tiny thing, right? Like a radio or a cup or something like that. Now, how much of the universe have we actually seen? Man hasn't gone beyond moon, right? So when you don't know much of universe, how can you make this comparison, make a statement? It's like a toddler saying, I have the greatest dad in the whole world. I mean, how many dads have you seen? Right? Your own dad and your neighbor's dad. That's about it. So when you don't know, you should make those kinds of comparisons, because the reason I feel particularly strongly about it is all this simply makes brain looks just dizzyingly complex, and actually doesn't give you any insight, because in science we would like to simplify things, understand things, not just right admire their complexity or go crazy about it. So, but why is there so much hype? There are many reasons to it behind this hype and behind this almost an attempt to make brain look extremely complicated. First of all, remember we are living in the era of big science, or the era of large projects running science, right? So typically the way it works is you get some huge funding, you buy a lot of equipment which will let you measure things. Right, an MRI machine will let you measure brain structure and slice it up, and image it in terms of slices and look at its internal structure. So you buy this equipment and take a lot of pictures, make a lot of observations about brain. And since you need to tell your sponsors that you're doing a lot of stuff, right? You just publish this stuff in popular media, and then the sponsors think that, oh, you're doing something really big, and lots of stuff is coming out of your lab. And then so they get impressed, and then put in more funding, and then the cycle continues, right? So you need to keep showing that you're doing a lot of stuff, and simply by making observations using a lot of technology, you can show that you're doing a lot of stuff. But just making more observations doesn't necessarily translate into understanding that, because that's a whole different ball game. Okay, so that is one reason why this kind of a cycle of big funding and big projects cycle will just create a lot of activity without not necessarily translating into understanding. So then the other thing is, we should remember the neuroscience is a branch of biology, right? And computational neuroscience is kind of a marriage of computer science and mathematics and neuroscience. But neuroscience per se is a branch of biology, right? Now here I'm showing you a picture of this is a hand-drawn picture, very beautiful artwork, as you can see, by Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, who has looked at microorganisms from probably the earliest microscope, and he has done all these pictures. And you can see that I don't know. I'm sure you have in your biology labs, you might have seen bacteria and all that in a microscope. They don't look anything like this. What you see on this in this artwork, it's very beautiful artwork, but there's a lot of imagination going on here. And you see, so this is biology in its original tradition. It's very descriptive. You literally draw pictures of what you see, and Antoine von Leeuwenhoek has used this crude microscope, and just can use imagination and drawn all these pictures. And now we use more fancy equipment like uh, you know 3-photon microscope or 2-photon microscope or 7 Tesla MRI scanner and so on and so forth. But it's still collecting data and in a way kind of making observations and pictures. So when you have a lot of technology, access to technology, and you have a lot of observations that you can make, you'll end up with mountains and mountains of data, but that doesn't necessarily translate into an insight or understanding. And this aspect of not just neuroscience, but all biology was captured very well by Yuri Lazarnik in this article called Can a Biologist Fix a Radio? Right, is fixing a light bulb. There's a lot of jokes about fixing a light bulb, right? You might have heard of some of these jokes. Now, this is like a takeoff on that kind of a line. So in this article, Lazarnik says, gives you some kind of a thought imaginary situation where a biologist is asked to understand how radio works. Okay, so in a typical biology tradition, so in biology, whenever you want to study something, you first acquire a lot of copies of that. So you want to study certain cell or a molecule. You want to study a gene. You first express that gene in lots of cells. You buy those cells and express gene in lots of cells, and then you make observations. What's going on? So similarly, if a biologist wants to understand a radio, they would buy lots of these printed circuit boards, which is the core of a radio, right? And then they would go something like this. So if you see this picture, you say, oh, okay, I see some black thingies, some blue thingies, and blue thingies are cylindrical and vertical. The black thingies have legs, it has silver legs, and there are typically 8 legs, and and so on and so forth. You can describe them all to great detail, great excruciating detail, and make notes and make diagrams and measure them, their thickness and length and all that. And this goes on and on and on. Okay, let's say that you call this the structural study. I mean, tomorrow if you study biology, right, you big part of it is structural biology, just the shape of things in biological systems. So after the structural study, you would go to functional study. What does functional study mean? Studying the function. So how do you do that? So for a radio, what is its function? To produce sounds, right? When you tune into a station. So then now you want to understand how does it produce sound? So how does a biologist approach the problem? Right? You power it up, and then you want to understand which of these components helps you generate the sound. So how do you figure it out? You just pull out the components one at a time. It is called all things being equal. I change one parameter in a complex biological system and try to find out what's going on. That's how biology works. So you do the same thing with a radio. You do that on and on. I mean, it's if you in a complex radio like this with so many hundreds of components, if you just pull out one capacitor or a resistor somewhere, nothing much might happen. Right. So that's what will happen. I mean, if you don't find much going on. But suppose accidentally you pull out a wire which carries power from the mains to the printed circuit board. That's it. I mean, but there's no power, so radio stops producing sound. And that becomes a huge discovery. And in the person, the postdoc who discovered that this this wire, right? So we'll get funding. So this article actually makes fun of this kind of research, and that's why things look so complicated. Things are kind of made complicated because of this kind of an approach. Whereas if an engineer looks at the same problem, you don't try to pull out components one by one to figure out what it does. You need to have a big picture understand. What is a big picture understanding of a radio? So for that, you need to understand that there is such a thing called an electromagnetic wave. You need to first know that. I mean, no amount of observation might let you, just know understand that. So, and then in case of a radio, there's a message signal, which is also an automatic signal, which is made to ride on top of a carrier signal, which is also an automatic signal. And then there's a special electronic circuit called a tuner circuit, which can resonate with this carrier signal, right, which is tuned to that frequency, and then you pick it up. And then you demodulate it, tease apart the message signal, amplify it, and feed it into a speaker, and you get the sound. Right, this is a big picture. Now, the same overall logic is implemented by different radio companies in a circuit form in slightly different fashion. But otherwise, no matter what kind of radio you're looking at, which company's radio you're looking at, this is the big picture. Now, this kind of a big picture understanding, if you have about the brain which will look very simple, right? But that's not how we normally approach brain, both on the clinical domain, like medical people, doctors, when they approach brain, it's not like this. If you look at a hardcore biologist and neuroscientist, a neurobiologist who looks at brain, again, it's not like this. There's immense amount of attention given to details, so everything looks so complicated. So whereas in computational neuroscience, we don't make this, at least in systems neuroscience, you don't make this mistake and you try to get the big picture right. So I'm harping so much on getting the big picture right because without that, brain looks extremely complicated. With that, brain looks quite manageable. So that's another reason, right, why neuroscience and brain looks very complicated. The third reason is that, remember we are living in the era of big data. So some of you guys said you're interested in AI and big data and all that. This is the current world that we live in. So there's so much interest in big data and there's data stealing going on at grand scale. And so data is a big issue right now. Now, if you look at history of science and how science has evolved over the centuries, right? All science begins with observations. You just look at something, look at, study it and then make observations and record them and look at, patterns, things. That's how experimental branch is the first branch of science. Then the mathematical theory comes later. So you look at all this data and try to put formula, fit all this data using formulae, and that's how theory begins. So these two are the oldest branches of science. The third branch is computation, which is more recent, it's half a century old, right? And since then, people began using computers to aid your mathematical calculations. Because very often the math gets so complicated that you cannot just do it, on the back of a paper. So you are began to use computers more and more in scientific research. The fourth pillar is the one where data comes in, and that is the more recent one. And it's become a pillar. It's not just earlier it was used to be on the margins, but now it's one of the founding pillars. And because this kind of a status given to data, right? We just generate lots of data using technology and then create mountains of data without making a commensurate effort to make sense out of the data. Because sometimes people say, no, we have data, we always have these AI models, we just train the networks, and we have a working model. I mean, why bother about theory in its traditional sense? So that's what even a lot of people are arguing. I mean, we can argue about that in both ways, but so therefore, because we are living in this big data era, neuroscience today is very data intensive. Like, when you talk about data in neuroscience, this data comes from different levels in the brain, right? If you look at any complex object, you have at the lowest level, you have molecules, cells, atoms and molecules. Since it's a biological tissue, an organ in the body, at slightly higher level, you have cells, which is neurons in case of brain. If you go to slightly higher level, you have networks of neurons, small networks of neurons. If you go to even higher level, you have systems in the brain, like the visual system, which processes how brain processes, which explains how brain processes images, or the motor system, which controls how you make movements with your body. Right? These are systems, and then the whole brain. So the multiple levels, right? So we have so much technology these days. We have tons and tons of data that's being generated, day in and day out at all these levels. So data is not a problem. We have too much data actually in neuroscience. So for example, on this slide, I'm showing you some pictures of neurons because the brain is basically a network of neurons. It's a huge 100 billion neuron network. So one thing special about neurons is if you take any cell, a random cell, it's like a blob, like a fluid filled blob, right? There's a membrane, cell membrane, a lipid bilayer membrane, inside which there's a liquid material and then bunch of organelles and nucleus and all this stuff. Neuron is no different, but what distinguishes neuron from other cells is all this wiry, hairy stuff sticking out. Right? You see, so neuron is not just one particular kind of cell, it's a whole large family of cells. Because depending upon the kind of the arbors and number of wires a neuron has, you can group them into many subcategories. So, but what is common to all the neurons is lots of wires sticking out of the cell. So there are atlases, people have models of different types of neurons, right? And for example, what is its size? What is the size of the cell body? What is the number of fibers and their branching patterns, their electrical properties? Name it and you have it. All these atlases are available and they're published. Next comes, so once you're done with the single cell, you go to networks of cells. How are neurons connected? In fact, the brain or nervous system itself is basically a network of neurons, right? So a big project, when if you want to understand how neurons are connected in the brain, right? A big grand project which everybody's talking about is the connectome project. Genome project is all about figuring out the entire set of genes in a given organism. So likewise, the connectome project is to figure out the entire set of connections in a given nervous system. So with 100 billion neurons in an adult brain, and where each neuron is connected to like 1,000 to 10,000 neighbors, and sometimes in extreme cases, a single neuron can be connected to like a couple of 100,000 other neurons. You're looking at like a trillion connections in human brain, right? So it's a extremely complex network. So to work out the entire connectome for the human brain is extremely complicated. So people have begun looking at smaller organisms, like there's this little worm called C. elegans. Popularly, it's called a nematode. which has only about 302 neurons and 7,000 connections or 7 to 8,000 connections. So this network is completely mapped out, worked out, and long ago, and that's a very nice example of a successful connectome project. When it comes to human connectome, what people are doing is it's very hard, very ambitious to figure out among this 100 billion neurons which neuron is connected to which other neuron. That's extremely complicated. But all the people are gunning for those kinds of that level of knowledge, that level of detail in knowledge. But at a slightly gross scale, people we still know even now people are able to divide the whole brain into a few couple of hundred regions and then figure out which region is connected to which other region. So this is human connectome project at a slightly sort of low resolution. That kind of work is going on. There's a lot of data available. But at this point, I would like to ask, right? Okay, there's so much effort going on, so much money is being invested in figuring out this connectome, right? How about trying to make sense out of all this connectome data? So, for example, if you want to understand, if you always want to talk in terms of underlying principles and not just carried away by data, the kind of logical questions you can ask about the connectome is, first of all, let us try to make sense out of the overall shape of the brain. Why does the human brain have these two hemispheres? Why can't there be like a heart's chambers? Why can't there be four quadrants or something? I don't know, or seven chambers. Why two? And why is there this kind of a symmetry, this kind of a bilateral symmetry in human brain, right? And another interesting feature of the brain is that sheet of cells called cortex, right, which literally covers the entire brain surface, right? Inside the brain, you have these masses of neurons, like forming structures like thalamus and hypothalamus and amygdala and hippocampus. These are solid structures which are masses of neurons. But in addition to that, you have this sheet of cells everywhere surrounding the entire brain surface. Why is it like that? Why did nature evolve the brain and shape it on those lines? And similarly, most brain structures are inside this two hemispheres, except there's one exception to this, the cerebellum, which sticks out of the brain from behind. It's kind of near your nape of your neck. Why is it like that? Because instead of just getting carried away by the data, at every point in biology, at least in neuroscience, if you can ask why is it like that, it will give you an immense amount of knowledge and insight, right? Whereas in the big data era, you rarely ask why. It's all about getting more and more data without asking why is the data like that. So because of this tendency to simply collect data for its own sake and like just accumulate this data, people don't ask questions like why and why not and as often as they should. And therefore, what happens is on one hand, you have big data, on the other hand, you have tiny theory. Theory is not very rich, right? Not adequate enough to capture all this data, right? So for example, this is where I want to go off on a slight historical kind of an interlude. Do you guys read the history? Do you like history? Do you watch history movies or history videos? Right. Very often when we talk about history, it's about the stories of kings and right kingdoms and wars and revolutions, right? But there's also science history, which is equally interesting. The history of how ideas evolve, right, over the centuries and how people begin with very crude ideas of something and how it gets refined over the centuries and all that. So I'll trace a quick trajectory of the history of one important branch of science, which is astronomy. And I'll compare the evolution of astronomy with the evolution of neuroscience today. And you will see very stark similarities. And you will also appreciate where neuroscience is today if you understand how astronomy has evolved over the last 2 millennia, right? I mean, starting from like Ptolemy or something. So way back in 180, first century, like in AD, Ptolemy tried to map all the known stars, visible stars in the sky, and he also looked at a lot of planetary orbit, planetary motion data, and kind of documented all that. So when you look at other planets, at those days, people thought that Earth is the center of the universe, right? Everything went around the Earth. So when you look at other planets going around the Earth, their orbits look very complicated because we know now that Sun is the center of the solar system, and both Earth and other planets, right? They go around the Sun. So when you look at one planet from another moving planet, the other planet seems to have a very complex trajectory. Okay, but only when you keep the center sun as a center and reference, right? All the orbits look very simple and elliptical. So this guy didn't know that, right? They thought these guys they all thought that sun is, no, Earth is the center of the universe. So when you look at other planets, they all look very complicated, and he was trying to fit some kind of a geometric patterns to that. And there's this curve called epicycle, which is one cycle superimposed on another cycle. He fitted these epicycles and they were fitting reasonably well. And he made all these maps, right? Now, the epicycles look very complex just because it was a bad model. As a paradigm, it's a bad paradigm. But paradigm is wrong, but they were just interested in data. So they couldn't figure out the right paradigm. Then fast forward some 1500 years, roughly 1400 years. This is, I think, Danish uh, astronomer called Tycho Brahe. So this guy had lots of resources. So in Tycho Brahe's time, already the predictions of various astronomical events, because in those days, people used to use astronomy for predicting life events, which now you think is a pseudoscience. But those days, people used to look at eclipses and things like that and predict wars and the results of wars and things like that. I mean, now we don't do that now, but it was very common. So therefore, they needed to know precisely when the next eclipse is going to hit you and stuff like that. And arrival of comets, all that they needed to predict and know the timing very precisely. So by Tycho Brahe's time, already these predictions were off, like by days and stuff like that. So Tycho Brahe wanted to fix this problem, and what did he do? So they were all struggling with the geocentric model, even in all this 1,500 years. He didn't try to fix that problem. He just tried to fix the problem of data. So what did he do? He just decided to observe the planets more frequently. Instead of observing it once a week or once a month, he said, let us observe it every night and multiple times every night. So you just get more data. He's taken this big data approach, and his predictions were more accurate, but his paradigm was still quite wrong. So what he said is he came up with this hybrid model where Earth is the center partly, and Sun and Moon went around the Earth, but the other planets went around the Sun, which is very weird. But he had to come up with this kind of a mixed model because to make some peace with Church. Because if he's going to say Earth is not the center of the world, the Church will get him. So he wanted to save his skin. So he came up with this kind of a mixed model. So paradigmatically, he is quite still wrong, right? But is better than what Ptolemy did. Okay, then came Kepler. So Kepler, even as a child, was very fascinated by astronomy and what happens in the heavens and all that. As a child, he saw this great comet of 1577, and that really caught his imagination. And he lived a life of poverty all his life. I mean, he's literally living hand to mouth. His mom was imprisoned on the excuse that she was doing witchcraft. Right, she was only selling herbs, right, to cure diseases, but that was branded as witchcraft, and she was imprisoned. This guy had to struggle to get her out of the prison, and he was very poor. And right, I mean, it's really a hard life. And while living that kind of a life on one side, he was trying to figure out planetary orbits. I mean, it's really scientific passion, at its extreme. So he had bad eyesight, right? So he didn't get into observational astronomy much. He said, "Let me do theory because my eyes don't permit me to do serious observational astronomy." So he tried to come up with a model of the planetary data that was available at that time. Right? They knew the distance of various planets from the sun and things like that, because Copernicus was already there, and they had heliocentric model and all that. So sun is the center of the solar system. So he tried to invoke some arguments using what are called Platonic solids. You all have heard of polyhedra, right? The regular polyhedra. Yes. Yeah. There are only 5 possible regular polyhedra. So regular polygons is a different story. You can have a polygon of any number of sides, but a polyhedron you cannot have of any number of possible number of faces. Only 5 are possible, and you can even show it using very simple algebra. So this regular polyhedra has fascinated even ancient Greeks. They were using them all over the place, and they literally they're going crazy with the regular polyhedra. So he invoked these polyhedra to try to account for planetary orbits, but all that didn't go anywhere. But finally, he has come up with this suddenly a brainwave that, right, all along he was trying to fit circular patterns to planetary orbits. And once he had a brainwave that no, it cannot be a circle, probably it's an ellipse, right? The sun at the focus, and then that fitted like millennia of planetary data in miraculously. And he saw deep patterns in the data, and he came up with these three laws of Kepler. Um, Interestingly, way back in I think around 1 BC or so in Alexandria, right, the city of Alexandria in Egypt, there was this scholar called Hypatia. Apparently, even she has conceived of elliptical orbits for for planets, but people forgot about it, and then so now we give credit to this idea to Kepler, but apparently even Hypatia has thought of the same thing way back, right, in Alexandria. So Kepler came up with these data patterns, and then Newton picked up on them, and he saw a very deep mathematical law underlying Kepler's laws. And he invented calculus, and along with Leibniz and several others, and came up with this law of gravitation, inverse square law, and that. So from this, you just end up with just two equations, two differential equations, with which you can explain planetary motion and not only motion of planets but of comets. The orbit can be parabolic or circular or elliptical, hyperbolic. Right, all this come from a common class of curves called conic sections. Right, so once Newton figured out planetary motion using his equations, suddenly it gave rise to a new law, and that's the universal law of gravitation. Until then, we just had charts, we just had data, we just had at the best data patterns like what Kepler did. But once Newton figured out his equations, we had universal laws. To look at his confidence, I mean, so which universal means what? The same laws should be applicable wherever you go in the universe, right? I mean, from struggling to figure out, decide between Earth being the center or Sun being the center, right? Suddenly, this man has the guts to imagine that the same equation will be valid everywhere in the universe. So you see the transition of different stages of evolution of ideas in astronomy. The earliest is always there's lots of data, and put them together, make pictures, and right fit some kind of a curves. That is the first stage in any science. The second stage is actually more data, even more, just to make it more accurate, right? And then okay, so the first stage, the data is there, but the paradigm is completely wrong. Paradigm is not even there. It's not even important. Very sketchy. It's totally wrong. The second stage, there is some, excuse me. The second stage paradigm is improved a bit because people have begun to think about paradigm. It's not just data. You need to get the paradigm right. The third stage, paradigm is completely right. And they went on to the stage of data patterns. It's not just data. The fourth stage is where you discover deep underlying laws and principles, right, behind all this data. That's when you say the science, a branch of science has arrived, has become mature. By this criterion, right, by this standard, do we say neuroscience is right matured or has arrived? Not very sure because I just as an example, I want to mention that there's this book called Principles of Neuroscience, Neural Science. In fact, when I went for a postdoc in Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, that was way back in 1997. So I had a brilliant teacher called Reed Montague. The first thing he could see me and he understood that I don't know anything about neuroscience. So so he had to teach me. So he said he just gave me this book, a copy of an older edition, and said, read this book cover to cover. It's a 1,000-page book, and now it's probably even fatter. So that's what I did. It took me a whole month to read this book. It's a brilliant book. I mean, simply, once you read this book, you will just be hooked. I mean, you'll decide that neuroscience is for you and nothing else. It's such a brilliant book. Now, the title says Principles of Neural Science. Right now, there is this British neuroscientist called David Walpott or Daniel Walpott. So he makes a joke about this book in one of the conferences. You know what he says? look, this book is supposed to be about principles, but if it is principles are always very economical, very compact, right? Minimal. There's a handful of principles and everything comes from that. That's what principles are about. If this book is about principles, why does it get fatter and fatter with every edition? Now, I've read fourth edition when I was a postdoc, and now probably sixth or seventh edition is out. It's getting fatter. So there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of progress to be made. I just want to compare this book with Newton's Principia Mathematica, right? Philosophiae Naturalis, Principia Mathematica, where he put all this calculus, all this, this fundamental equations into one book. And he said, look, this book explains all nature. I mean, that's right. That's really brilliant. So it'd be nice to have that kind of a book written about brain today. We don't have that kind of book yet. So there are several people in the community, in the neuroscience community, who are talking about this issue. And one person I can mention is V.S. Ramachandran. Who's Indian origin scientist, neuroscientist. He worked in University of California, San Diego, all his, I think, for most part of it his career, but he's retired now. And he says that we are at the Faraday stage in neuroscience. That means, Michael Faraday, he discovered the law of induction in electrical engineering, electrical science. So that's still midway. Right after Faraday, there's a guy called John Maxwell who has come up with the Maxwell equations, and that's when you have a complete story of electromagnetism. Until then, it's a midway story. So Ramchandran says we are like at a Faraday stage in neuroscience. So we have a long way to go. And because in terms of theoretical understanding. Then Patricia Churchland also talks on similar lines. She says there are no neural theories, no good ones anyway. So we still have a lot of work to do in theory building in neuroscience. One more reason why brain is so complicated is the problem of reductionism. That is, in biology, people like to explain everything in terms of the smallest constituents. What's right? Reduce everything to the smallest constituent, which is cells and molecules. So whereas in engineering, we don't make that mistake, right? When you look at brain from engineering point of view, or there's no need to explain everything in terms of smallest constituent, which is your single neurons, right? If you look at, for example, aeronautical engineering, you want to study, you want to design an aircraft wing, right? You want it to have so much thrust and should be able to go at certain speed, and then you don't try to study the effect of air molecules on the wing as collide with the wing and things like that. You look at whole bunches of air molecules, you call it a fluid, right? And then apply fluid mechanics, Navier-Stokes equations, and you can design aircraft wing very well. If you go down to the smallest constituent, which is molecules, it becomes a nightmare. It becomes extremely complicated, right? In engineering, we don't do that. We don't make that mistake. So because of all these problems I have tried to outline, right? What happens in brain theory, in computational neuroscience today? You have lots of different modeling approaches, different pockets of mathematics, right? And then each approach, each little body of math looks at brain at one scale or one aspect of it, explains a bunch of things, and that's about it, right? So you have all these many different fragments, and the big challenge now is how to connect all of them and construct a grand theory. And because of this, also there is disproportionate development, right? You have lots of data, but you have poor understanding at systems level. And because of this, even disorders, when we try to understand disorders, right, we don't have a good theory of the most of the major brain disorders. There's one problem with the way we understand disease, like not only in neuroscience, but disease in general, is for a long time we are used to thinking of diseases being caused by a certain germ, like a bug, like a microbe, right? A microorganism. It could be a bacteria or a virus or whatever. There are a lot of diseases are of that kind, but unfortunately, brain disorders are different. They are multifactorial disorders. There need not be any single germ responsible for the disease. So the same approach will not work. So you need something else. Okay, so I'll skip some of this stuff because very often, even when you have um, medication, right, we don't fully understand how the medication works. So any questions, by the way, on what we discussed so far? I still have like about 10 minutes to go, but okay. So yeah, they're very interesting treatments, but very often we don't understand how the treatment works. Like a couple of examples I can give here. There is something called vagus nerve stimulation, that you put an electrode around the vagus nerve, which is goes next to the neck here, and electrically stimulate the brain. Right now, this treatment is used for both epilepsy, which is problem happening at the highest levels of the brain, right, and even depression. Right now, the same vagus nerve controls cardiac function. It controls your heart. And if you overstimulate the vagus nerve, it will slow down the heart. It can even lead to heart cardiac arrest. It will completely stop the heart. So it's quite a dangerous treatment, right? And but using this approach, people try to fix both epilepsy and depression. So why does it work? We don't know, right? We do it just because it works. And there's a very interesting book called Prescriptions for the Mind, written by a psychiatrist, Joel Paris. He says the same thing about psychiatric drugs, all these drug families. And he says, like in this book, one should also keep in mind that we do not know how most of these drugs used for mental disorders work. Okay, so I'll skip some of this stuff. And so hope you got an idea of where things stand, right? Uh, we still have a long way to go in creating a comprehensive, integrative, right, theory of the brain. And only with that, we'll be able to understand disorders better. And only if you understand disorders better, we'll be able to come up with better treatments. So how will that kind of theory look? So for that, just like in physics or engineering, we need simplified brain models. We need to capture the right abstraction. Right? It shouldn't be too detailed, shouldn't be too uh, abstract. There's the right balance. Right? We need to have this minimalist simplified model, just like what we do in physics engineering. Because in physics engineering, the kind of math we deal with, it has a sense of universality, right? Whatever equations that you figure out, the fundamental equations, they're applicable in a wide variety of contexts. That's the beauty of engineering. That's why engineering is so rigorous. Now, that kind of math in neuroscience and computational neuroscience, it is there in pockets, but we don't have the full story. So in my lab, what we've been trying to do, right, is to come up with a whole brain model, right, in this minimalist fashion. It's not extremely detailed, but captures the whole brain. It'll have all these major brain structures. So in this picture, I'm showing you kind of a cartoon model of the brain, right? You can think of brain as a large input-output system, right? Basically, what the brain does is take sensory input from the world, processes it, and produces motor output. Like look at some image, and then you move your hand. Somebody's throwing a ball at you. That's a visual input, and you move your hand to catch the ball. There's a motor output. So sensory input and motor output. Think of it as big, like in a box, which takes sensory inputs and produces motor output. And so that's the main pathway that you see in this picture. And then there are three major kind of detours, side roads, if you can, so to speak. These are cerebellum, basal ganglia, and hippocampus. Right, so this is a cartoon picture of the brain, and if you can figure out this cartoon picture, this itself is quite a complex, quite an ambitious project. But we have been over the last 10, 15 years, 20 years, we've worked on many aspects of the brain, of the adult brain. And we're trying to piece all these pieces together so that we'll be able to construct the whole brain maybe in the next 5, 10 years. Right. So my lab is divided into different teams. Each team works on one part of this bigger problem. So that's right. So that's all from me.